PhD student Pietro Shakarian. He is going to be talking about the book Journey to Ararat, an expedition of a Baltic explorer in a Russo-Turkish borderland. It's a book that he wrote a critical introduction for. He received his master's degree from the University of Michigan in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and he wrote his MA thesis entitled Schools Without Walls, Political Reform and the Historical Evolution of Innovative Education in Soviet and Post-Soviet Armenia. He also has a master's degree of Library and Information Science with a focus in special collections and preservations, and a bachelor's he earned from John Carroll University, where he wrote a senior thesis titled Haze over Ararat, the Role of Environmentalism in the Rise of the Armenian National Movement in the Era of Glasnost, from 1986 to 1991. He is quite a distinguished young scholar, and he has received numerous awards through his years at university, including an American Values Scholarship, a JCU Catholic Studies Scholarship, University of Michigan's Armenian Studies Grant, and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies Fellowship. He has also written many articles about Russian and Caucasus foreign policy for publications such as Russia Direct, The Nation, and The Armenite, as well as critical introductions for 3 books, Transcaucasia and the Tribes of the Caucasus, The Red Flag at Ararat, and Journey to Ararat, which he will be speaking on today. So welcome to CEAS, and thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. First, I just want to say it's wonderful to be here today with you, my friends. And so basically today I'm going to be talking about Journey to Ararat, which is Friedrich Parrot's expedition to Mount Ararat, Friedrich Parrot being this great Baltic German explorer. So that's like basically the first half of this lecture. The second half is going to cover kind of the Russo-Turkish borderlands, Russian-Turkish relations, because Mount Ararat was historically part of the Russo-Turkish borderland, and I'm going to be kind of talking about the current day politics associated with that. So, to start off with, why is Parrot's account significant? And I think one of the reasons why it's significant is he's this Baltic German explorer from up here, from Estonia, and he travels all the way through Central Russia, through Ukraine, through Kalmykia, into the North Caucasus, to Georgia, and then to Armenia. And it's significant because it's a Baltic German guy who's looking at this multi-ethnic Russian Empire. I mean, it's the multi-ethnic Russian Empire through the eyes of the non-Russian. So right there, it's a first-hand account of this vastly diverse state through the eyes of somebody who is himself not a Russian. So even the idea of Russian Empire is kind of a misnomer, but this is Rossiyskoye Imperii, so technically, yes, it is the more inclusive variant. But Mount Ararat, so you have, why is this mountain significant? And for Christians, I mean, it has this great significance in the Christian discourse as being the place where Noah's Ark rested, according to the book of Genesis. Now, if you ask people like in theology and hermeneutics, they would tell you, well, Genesis shouldn't be taken literally, but some Christian denominations do take it literally. But also Mount Ararat is very symbolic as a symbol of Armenian national identity. You go to Yerevan, it's everywhere, it's on t-shirts, it's on posters, it's on postcards, it's pretty much anywhere you can imagine it, it is the symbol. You can see it from Yerevan, the Armenian capital. So it is the national symbol. And at the time of Parrot's expedition, people thought it couldn't be climbed. And there were 2 camps who were convinced it couldn't be climbed. A scientific camp, a secular camp, I should say, and a religious camp. So the religious camp were the conservative Armenian clergy who said, if you climb this mountain, it's sacrilege. I mean, you can't do that, But from the European scientific establishment, they said it's too steep, there's no way it can be climbed. So Parrot defied both camps in his expedition. So Parrot, I mentioned, he came from Estonia. He came from this town, Dorpat. That's actually the German name for the town that we would today call Tartu in Estonia, a very beautiful Baltic town. And Parrot worked as the physics professor at this university, the University of Dorpat, which is today the University of Tartu. And he came from a family of educators. His father, Georg Parrot, was a very progressive, reform-minded, Enlightenment-thinking educator in the Russian Empire. And he was very good friends with Tsar Alexandra I. And Tsar Alexandra I saw himself as an enlightened monarch in the tradition of Catherine, in the tradition of Peter. He saw himself in this vision. And Georg really played up to that. And he even delivered a speech praising the Tsar about this idea of being this great enlightened progressive monarch. And that actually infuriated the conservatives at the University of Dorpat. And in the end, Alexander rewarded this by giving the University of Dorpat a lot of autonomy within the Russian Empire, and even calling affectionately Georg Parrot his little Voltaire. So this was kind of, again, this is Parrot's father. So Parrot himself served as, he was the physics professor at Dorpat, but he served as a medic in the Russian military during the Napoleonic Wars, and then after the Napoleonic Wars, he stayed in Europe. And in Europe, he basically began this interest in climbing mountains. He went to the Pyrenees, he went to the Alps, he developed this enthusiasm for climbing mountains. And he became known as essentially the pioneer of mountaineering within the Russian and also Estonian context. And so going to this, so Tsar Alexander I dies in 1825, December 1825, or at least that's the official account. There are also other accounts that he might have fled into Siberia and became a holy man. There's all this sort of thing. But officially in 1825, the Tsar passes on. And so there's a succession crisis. There's the Decembrist Revolt of 1825. And then the following year, already Russia had tensions with Persia at the beginning of the 19th century over the Caucasian territories in the First Russo-Persian War. But then a second Russo-Persian War breaks out in 1826, and that lasts till 1828. In the Treaty of Turkmenchai, the Russians take territories down here, historical Armenian territories, including Etchmiadzin, that's the Armenian Vatican, the Armenian religious capital, and Mount Ararat, and of course, the Armenian capital, Yerevan. So Parrot decides this is a great opportunity. Now I can actually climb this mountain because it hasn't been part of a Christian empire in centuries. It would be unsafe if I tried to do it anywhere else, but now that it's part of Russia, I can climb this mountain, finally. So he goes with an expeditionary team all the way from Dorpat, and this expeditionary team includes a few students, some medical students, mineralogists. There was an astronomer, Vasily Fyodorov. They all travel from up here down through central Russia, through eastern Ukraine. They go to Donbass, which of course is a conflict zone today. Then they go to Kalmykia, and they go eventually down here to the North Caucasus. But actually, it splits. The groups split. So at one point, a section of Dorpat students end up going to Stavropol, and Parrot and Parrot and another student go to basically go to kind of the Manik region over here, also known as Kalmykia, where they want to investigate kind of the level between the Caspian and Black Seas to see if they were at one point united. And at this point, they encounter these very fascinating people known as the Kalmyks, who are actually the only Buddhist people in Europe who live in the Russian Empire and actually today Russia. And Parrot, another interesting theme in his account is how sensitive he is towards these different nationalities. This is at a time in Europe where you might have Orientalism, you might have kind of discrimination against different groups. But Parrot's very sensitive. He actually meets with a Buddhist Kalmyk family, and he's impressed by by their son, and he invites the son to have a scholarship and to go and attend university at Dorpat. And the parents refuse because they're worried that the son might become Christian, he might lose his Buddhist ways and all this. And Parrot decides, okay, it's fine. You guys, I'm not going to push this issue, it's okay. And similarly, later on in the book, the Pasha of Bayezid, the Kurdish Pasha, has an audience with Parrot, and he's like a POW from the Russo-Turkish War. And Parrot is going to see him, and he understands that the Pasha is doing his Islamic prayer. And so he waits for the Pasha very sensitively to finish his prayer, and then he goes in and sees him. So there's this constant theme of a sensitivity towards different ethnic and religious groups in the Russian Empire at the time on the part of Parrot. So after this, Parrot meets up with his team again. They meet in Mozdok, around here in the North Caucasus, and then they go down to Tiflis. So basically they're going down here to Tiflis, or Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, the great multi-ethnic center of the Caucasus. But Parrot doesn't have this very overly romanticized view of Tiflis, because it's an exceptionally hot summer, and him and his team are kind of, they find it insufferable, the heat. So they don't really enjoy this experience too much, even though I love this city. I mean, it's a fantastic place. If you ever go there, it's a wonderful town. But they don't particularly enjoy it, right? But they can't go to Armenia because Armenia at the time is under this horrific plague. And even at the time, other travelers recount it. Even Pushkin recounts it in his journey to Erzurum. He talks about an Armenian priest that he encounters traveling from Yerevan to Akhalzik in Georgia. And he says, I encountered an Armenian priest traveling from Yerevan to Akhalzik. What's new in Akhalzik? I asked him. Or what's new in Yerevan, excuse me, I asked him. In Yerevan, they've got the plague, he replied. And what's news from Akhalzik? In Akhalzik, they have the plague, I replied. And after exchanging this pleasant news, we parted. So it's kind of a little bit of dark humor, but it communicates this idea there was a plague at the time in Armenia. And so Parrot and his team decide, well, we can't do this, so what are we going to do? And they decide to actually go to this part of Georgia here, known as Kakheti. So Kakheti is like the center of Georgian viticulture. It's a major wine-producing region. But there is a major problem because the Kakhetians, and actually they meet a Georgian prince, Georgiadze, so it's a really, it's a wonderful time down there in Kakheti, but they are under siege by Dagestani tribesmen, known as the Lesbi. So the Lesbi today, there's a group in the Caucasus in Dagestan and Azerbaijan-Dagestani border known as the Lesbi, but at the time this term Lesbi was used to describe a whole range of tribesmen in the Caucasus. And the Georgians had a term, Likia Nova, which basically means the raids from these tribesmen from Dagestan. So they were about to attack Kakheti, but a force of Russian military men, accompanied by a contingent of Georgians, scared them away. And that was pretty much the end of this attempted raid, and Parrot and his friends basically enjoyed themselves in Kakheti, and they did some explorations in southern Dagestan too, so in the end it was fine. And actually Parrot too, even later on in the account, visits Ingushetia, and he actually spends some time with the Ingush. They shelter him. And that's kind of another interesting thing, because again, the Ingush were actually very sympathetic to the Russians in the 19th century during the kind of Caucasian Wars. And so eventually they decide the plague subsides in Armenia, so they decide to travel from Kakheti to Tiflis and then down to Armenia, and in the Armyanska Oblast, as it was called at the time. So they go down here to Etchmiadzin, which is kind of the Armenian Vatican. That's the Armenian religious capital, the center of the Armenian Apostolic and Orthodox Church. And here they encounter a very chilly reception from the Catholicos Patriarch and the other Armenian clergy, who don't like the idea at all of climbing Mount Ararat because they see it as this you can't do, this is, this holy land, why would you do something like this? But one young man, a deacon in the Armenian church, Hachatora Bovian, was very enthusiastic about this, and later on actually he attends Dorpat under Parrot's tutelage and becomes a great progressive educator and writer in Armenia, the first Armenian writer to write in the vernacular language. So Abovian is very enthusiastic about this idea of climbing Ararat, and he goes with Parrot and his team. And from here, they go from Etchmiadzin, they cross the river Arax, and they end up here in Sirbakan, which is a Tatar village. And Tatar at the time, really in this time of the Russian Empire, this could mean anything. It can mean, not really anything, but like any kind of Islamic or Turkic group, right? But in this context, it specifically means Shia Muslim Turkic-speaking peoples who we today call Azerbaijanis. So this is an illustration from Parrot's account in the book, in Sirbakan. And from here, they go from Backbone to Akori on the northern slope of Mount Ararat. So to show you how close it is, here's a Soviet military map. And Akori is over here, Akora, actually it's written in Russian. And you can see how close it is to Bolshoi Ararat. So you can see how close it is to Greater Ararat. And here are some photographs kind of illustrating it. So the town today is known as Yeni Dogan in Turkey. You can see how close it is to the mountain in these photographs. It's very, very, very close. And so while they're here, they stay at this monastery, St. Jacob, which is an old Armenian monastery on the slope of Mount Ararat. But unfortunately, in 1840, long after Parrot's expedition, this monastery is destroyed by a terrible earthquake.
Is this on the east side or the west side of Ararat?
This is on the north side of Ararat, northeast actually. So there's a horrible earthquake, but there's still some Armenian traces here. There's still some Armenian khachkars. And the village is destroyed, the church is destroyed, but later on, in the mid-19th century, the village is later resettled by Kurds. So today, to this day in Turkey, this is actually a Kurdish village. So Parrot and Abovian is standing here, Parrot is sitting. Actually, Parrot himself has 2 attempts to get to Ararat that both end in failure or that they don't go far enough. And so there are these first 2 attempts, but then there's this 3rd attempt. And on the 3rd attempt, on October 9th, 1829, they reached the summit with 2, so Parrot and Abovian, with 2 Armenian villagers and 2 Russian soldiers, reached the peak of Mount Ararat. And from here, they can see the whole of the Armenian highland, they can see Lesser Ararat, they can see Lake Savan, they can see all these areas, historical landmarks and physical landmarks of Armenia. And they're overjoyed by actually reaching the summit. This is a huge moment. So Parrot, this is an original document from Estonia, from the Estonian Historical Archives, where they actually relate, where Parrot is actually relating that he climbed the mountain, he succeeded in climbing it. And Abovian was actually inspired to poetry. This is actually poetry that Abovian wrote right after he climbed the mountain, of how wonderful, how beautiful the experience was, you know. And then there's a smaller expedition to Lesser Ararat that's also a success. But there's also a lot of skepticism over Parrot's expedition. There's a gentleman from the European scientific establishment who questions whether or not this even happened. Because at the time, everybody was saying, there's no way. How can this have succeeded? This idea of climbing Mount Ararat, there's no way that it could have, you know, occurred. But Parrot actually, you know, defends himself and actually solicits accounts, testimonies of the actual expedition. So, in the end, here's Abovian's testimony from the St. Petersburgish Zeitung, which is a German language newspaper, and it was published in 1835. Again, this is the account of his whole understanding of the, I mean, this is his account, I should say, of the Ararat expedition and how successful it was. And later on, there was a second climbing of Mount Ararat by Spassky Avtaminov, who is a very famous Russian scholar. And so it proved after that, you know, this mountain, you know, it can be climbed over and over. It's not just, it's not a huge feat. And actually today, people climb it all the time. So it's not, at this point though, it was a huge feat to actually reach the top of the mountain. So what happens to Ararat after all this? So Ararat was part of this province of Russian Armenia known as Sur-Mali. And in the midst of the Russian Civil War and the Russian Revolution and all this, it ends up becoming part of Turkey, because Turkey ends up militarily occupying this province before the Bolsheviks can come down and re-Sovietize the Caucasus. So they end up controlling Greater Ararat. Right here is Artvin, a Georgian city, Ardahan, all these areas that actually were ceded from Russian Transcaucasia to Turkey because the Turks were under military control of it, and the Bolsheviks at this point, toward the winding end of the Civil War, had no appetite to have a war with Turkey. So they were like, okay, you can have that. But again, this is not the total end of the story, of what happens to Ararat, because Greater Ararat becomes part of Turkey in the Treaty of Moscow, but Lesser Ararat is still part of Persia, or Iran. And there's a major Kurdish rebellion in the vicinity of Mount Ararat from 1926 to 1930. And you can see the Kurdish rebels here. You can see a newspaper clipping from the Times. In London, you can see one of the Kurdish rebels here, kind of in a traditional kind of Kurdish headdress. His wife, ironically, is wearing a cloche hat, which is very fashionable for Western women in the 1920s. It's kind of interesting. And this rebellion is eventually crushed by Turkey. And when it's crushed, the Kurdish rebels flee into this area of Persia, Lesser Ararat, which is not really controlled by Iran. Iran doesn't really control that border. So Turkey goes into that territory and militarily occupies it, and eventually it's ceded to Turkey by Iran in border frontier negotiations between 1932 and 34, and Iran gets some other territories further to the south. But that's not the end of the story, because Stalin, after the World War II, brings up this idea of the Moscow Treaty and potentially annulling the treaty, saying, okay, we want to get our territories back. And if you read Khrushchev's memoirs, he mentions how Beria, a fellow Georgian who was the head of the secret police and one of Stalin's right-hand men, basically was goading Stalin that, you're Georgian, why don't you want these territories back, and this kind of thing. So Stalin eventually raises this issue of the Moscow Treaty. We should annul it, get our territories back. And also, but actually more pressing for Stalin was the Bosphorus Straits. He was more concerned about that. But these moves by the Soviets towards Turkey end up backfiring because it pushes Turkey more firmly in the Western camp, eventually culminating in NATO membership for Turkey. So for Stalin, I mean, in the end, the renegotiation of this treaty and the potential return of these territories becomes a moot point. And then you have this other issue that Khrushchev recalls in his memoirs, where on the Soviet-Armenian coat of arms, they have Ararat. And Turkey doesn't like this. They said, this is a territorial claim on our country. Why would you do this? And Khrushchev says, well, look, Turkey, you have the crescent on your flag. Okay, does that mean that you claim the moon, right? And in the end, Turkey kind of withdrew its claim after this. So that was that. And the Moscow Treaty represents kind of this high point in Russian-Turkish relations, because if you know the history of Russia and Turkey in the 19th century, they're almost always at war for some reason. And this is a huge moment that now they're not at war, that they're at peace, and this is most of the 20th century. And this is in happier times too. So this is then President Medvedev, now Prime Minister Medvedev, giving a portrait of the signing of the Moscow Treaty to President Erdogan of Turkey. So he's giving him the photograph of the signing of this treaty, and this again is in happier times, but these happy times don't last, because on November 24th, 2015, a Russian Sukhoi Su-24 fighter jet was shot down by Turkey over the Syrian frontier. And this is a huge issue, not just for Turkish-Russian relations, but also for global relations, because here you have a country, Turkey, shooting down a Russian plane. And Russia is a large nuclear-armed country, and Turkey is a member of NATO. And the United States is also a member of NATO. And the Western European countries are also members of NATO. So this could potentially get the West and Russia into a nuclear shooting war if this escalates too far out of hand. So for global relations, it was a very, very tense moment. And relations from there deteriorated pretty fast. So Putin was not very, and Russia, they were not very happy with this development. And here's an interesting meme I found online about that. And so the Russians, what do? They say, we're going to support the Kurds. So Turkey hates the Kurds. If you know anything about Turkey and their attitude, they hate the Kurds. So the Russians open up an embassy for the Syrian Kurds in Moscow, which there you see it there. And they open a representative office for the Turkish Kurds. And there's Demirtas, the leader of the Turkish Kurds, and Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. And this is an interesting graphic from 1958, from Newsweek actually, showing kind of the Russian hand, getting involved with the Kurds, which actually, the amount of Russian influence, it depends. I mean, how extensive it was, but still you get kind of this interesting graphic here, at least the Western perception of how involved Russia might have been with the Kurds at this time. And Erdogan is not happy at all about this because he doesn't like the Kurds and he doesn't like the Russians stirring things up. So he decides, I'm going to support the Tatars in Crimea. You know, I mean, you can't go wrong with this. So what he does is, so Crimea was part of the Russian Federation in the Soviet Union, and then Khrushchev transfers it to Ukraine because there's this whole issue with the Dnieper Canal. And in the end, it's, in post-Soviet terms, it becomes part of Ukraine as an autonomous region, but this never is fully settled. And as you know, with the Ukrainian crisis, it is eventually annexed by Russia. So what happens is, it becomes part of the Russian Federation de facto. You know, Ukraine still recognizes it as their territory. Pietro Shakarian certainly would agree with that assessment that this is our territory. And Erdogan decides, I'm going to support the Tatars because the Tatars, they have a history there. There's this whole history of deportation by Stalin or whatnot. And he thinks, I'm going to kind of back them against Russia, and we're going to kind of get even, So there's kind of a tit for tat. But then it further escalates because there's another Russian response. So the Communist Party of Russia, which this fellow here, Valery Rashkin, is very, very communist. You can see he has even a Communist Party tie. He has the Soviet flag behind him. He's very serious about his communism. And so he proposes this idea, let's annul the Moscow Treaty. Let's just give these territories back to Georgia and Armenia because we're such great friends. We have this idea of the Druzhba Narodov, the idea of the friendship of nations, so we should give these territories back to Armenia and Georgia. And to give a domestic political context, so Putin's party, United Russia, Yedinaya Rossiya, is actually, a lot of people say Putin is this totally, he controls everything, kind of autocratic guy, but there's an internal politics in Russia. And part of that internal politics is they're actually concerned about how influential these guys get, these communists. So Yedinaya Rossiya, often they would criticize Lenin or something to kind of discredit, the communists who are very influential. In this case, what they do is they take up the issue of the Moscow Treaty. They say, okay, we'll consider annulling it. So Maria Zakharova says, we'll consider the possibility of annulling the treaty. But this doesn't go anywhere, because the Russians and the Turks kind of make amends. As you can see here, Putin is kind of reconciling with Erdogan a little bit. However, Turkey and Russia, they have differing interests in Syria, so there's question about how extensive such a détente will be. And there are forces within Turkey that are opposed to such a détente, as the recent assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey on December 19th, 2016 indicated. So with that, I will leave you with the end. We don't know what's going to happen next, but that's pretty much it. So thank you.